Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. What is anthropology? Why is it a competitive advantage for R&D and innovation? So my name is Mike Holman. I'm a SVP and Group Director here at Lux Research, moderating today's session, and really excited to be sharing with you this presentation from Ujwal Arkalgud, who is the EVP and Group Director here at Lux and comes to us from MotivBase, a company he co-founded and that Lux has acquired. Really excited to explore these insights from anthropology that he's led the development of there, and how those can apply to R&D and innovation teams. You can type any questions you have throughout the webinar into the questions box on the screen. We'll have some time to answer questions at the end. But if your question doesn't get answered or you think it's something that comes up later, don't hesitate to email it to questions@LuxResearch.Inc. and we will respond. So with that, I'll hand things over to Ujwal.
Wonderful, thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. This is my first webinar within the Lux family, so I'm very excited to introduce the concept of anthropology to you. I'm sure some of you have either studied it in school, maybe you have formalized training in it, and if you do, fantastic. But really, my goal today is to introduce the concept of anthropology to you, explain to you why it's so significant in the modern world for R&D execs and practitioners, for innovation execs and practitioners, and why it can turn into a really critical advantage in an environment where we often struggle to not automatically end up where everybody else is ending up. And that's really the purpose of today's webinar, is to take you through this narrative and hopefully inspire you to think about culture, the consumer, and human beings a bit differently. First and foremost, I'll start with a simple quote that comes out of the field of anthropology. As human beings, we all act toward things on the basis of the meaning we ascribe to those things. We all inadvertently, organically, naturally, unknowingly give meaning to the world around us. And how we act is determined by that associated implicit meaning that we give to the world around us. And the role of anthropology in particular is to decode the implicit side of the meaning equation. So there's two types of meaning in this world. There's explicit meaning, which, I can say, hey, Mike, what does this photo mean to you? And Mike will describe it, and that's explicit because he can logically frame it up and describe that. And then there's also going to be the implicit side of the meaning equation. Anthropology helps us decode that, because anthropology is really the art and science of studying language to decode the implied ways in which we are communicating meaning. In order to illustrate this point, we use this model that we call the Iceberg model of meaning. Why iceberg? Very simple. The part of the iceberg that is visible above the surface of the water is your logical frame. It's the questions we tend to ask. It's the business problems we tend to frame. Why is it the visible part of the iceberg? Because it's logical. We can frame it. We can ask a consumer, ask a human being, ask a buyer that question. The problem is that usually when we get answers back, like, hey, would you buy a sustainable alternative to this razor? Usually the answer is, yes, of course I would buy a sustainable alternative. And you say, why? And the answer is, well, isn't it better for the environment? Isn't it better for future generations? But of course, as all of you know, when the rubber hits the road, human motivation is quite complex. It's quite different. And we don't always act in logical ways. And that is where anthropology comes into play, because there's two layers beneath the surface that anthropology helps us uncover. The first is a layer we call core beliefs. Core beliefs are, in essence, implicit meaning, implicit beliefs that we associate with any context, any idea. And core beliefs give organizations, give R&D execs, innovation execs direction. They tell us where we should go. It's the flashlight in the dark room. You also have another layer called manifestations. Now, manifestations are actually quite dangerous, because manifestations are examples of things people are doing or saying currently around that context. The reason manifestations must be separated from belief systems is because manifestations are inspiration. They're not direction. Why? Because they change, they flip-flop pretty frequently, especially in this pandemic, post-pandemic world. Core beliefs can be predicted. They move at a glacial pace. There's a sense of direction associated with them, and they help us build strategic direction and inspiration for our organizations. So this is really the role of anthropology. Now you might say, okay, but how can you decode the implicit belief system? In order to decode implicit belief system, what anthropology does is it says, we're going to study the language that the consumer, that human beings use on the internet, much like social media analytics or social media listening has done in the past and continues to do today. The main difference, though, is what social media analytics will do is focus on the literal. What anthropology will do is focus on the contextual. So what's the difference? I'll illustrate it with a simple example. Let's say your topic is sustainability. You want to study what sustainability means to people, let's say in the United States today. What analytics or social media analysis will do is go and literally pull data where the word sustainability or a bunch of its synonyms are mentioned. What does that give you? It gives you an analytical exercise, a logical exercise that tells you when people talk about sustainability, they also talk about, I don't know, waste. Now, what anthropology does is it says, the way human beings naturally engage is, I might start the conversation with sustainability. From there, the conversation may evolve into a conversation about nutrition. From there, the conversation may evolve to one about quality of food. What anthropology will say is, if all of these topics are still within the context of sustainability, they must not be discriminated against. They must be considered a part of the contextual boundary, and therefore they must be critical to how the human being is shaping and giving meaning to what sustainability is. When you apply anthropology, you discover things like sustainable food is a proxy for high quality food. If you apply analytics, you will discover things like sustainable food is something that is plant-based. That's the difference. And it's those proxies, it's those idiosyncratic meaning associations. That's where the magic lies. That's where the competitive advantage lies. Why? Because your competitors will not easily find that kind of stuff. That's where the real richness is. That's where you get direction for your organization. And the reason why this is so powerful in the modern world is, and I'm sure all of you experience this problem. We talk to and work with a lot of R&D and innovation executives and practitioners every single day. And the most common challenges we hear from them is, how do I know what's real? How do I know what is actually real versus a fad or, you know, a shiny object? How do I then size it? How do I time it? And then how do I operationalize it? These are all common problems. I feel like, you know, these problems have been around for a long time. But we expect in the modern world to be able to solve these with all these incredible tools and technologies that we have at our disposal. This is where anthropology comes into play, because it allows us to do this. But I'll take it a step further. Not only does it allow us to answer and solve some of these challenges, it also allows us to do this, whether it be it in a B2C setting or in a B2B setting. And I'll show you an example later where we're going to talk about the example of how food waste is interpreted in culture today. And in that example, I'll illustrate to you what a B2C company would do there with that insight versus what a B2B company would do. But ultimately, whether we like it or not, doesn't matter whether we're a hospital, doesn't matter whether we make a chemical that is sold to other CPG companies, it doesn't matter whether we're a CPG company selling razors to consumers. We're all impacted by the shifting meanings, belief systems that human beings associate in the world around us. And it all trickles back up to our organizations, to our senior leadership, to our executives, our boards, and anthropology helps us understand this and measure it and model it so we can actually operationalize this stuff. So let's build on the model that I illustrated earlier, and let's talk about a concept called maturity, which is really central to the power of anthropology. Now, let's imagine that you're looking at the culture of sustainability, and in this culture, on your screen, hopefully the colors are nicely visible. You'll see a whole bunch of dots, and you'll see a bunch of dots in a whole bunch of different, in a variety of different colors. What this is illustrating is that the way people talk about the topic of sustainability, this is hypothetical, is very diverse, i.e., every color represents a unique theme of meaning that people associate with sustainability. So when you see a whole bunch of diversity of language use within a context, it indicates the culture is immature. Why is it immature? Very simple. none of us seem to agree on what it means. And if none of us can agree on what this thing means, it is immature. Now, let's contrast that with a culture that looks something like this. A lot of dots are yellow. In essence, there's a more unified understanding of what the topic of sustainability means. And in this hypothetical example, you're actually looking at a more mature culture. Why? Because there's a lot of consensus that's already built on what something means. Now, this concept plays out in a rather, I guess, funny way in this simple example, right? Close your eyes for a second, indulge me. And I'm going to say the word burger. What did you think? Most of you will think of pretty much the same thing. Therefore, we all agree, have consensus on what burger means, and you'll see MotivBase maps it in an established idea on the right extreme end in blue. Now close your eyes again, and I'm going to say gourmet burger. What happened now? Some of you disagreed on the definition of what makes a burger gourmet. So now we've pulled the culture back in maturity to mainstream acceptance. So there's still quite a bit of consensus on what a gourmet burger is, but it's not fully established. Now close your eyes one more time, and I'm going to say, now imagine a sustainable gourmet burger. What happens here? A lot of us disagree on how to define a sustainable gourmet burger. Now we've pulled the culture all the way back into early consensus. I'm illustrating this through this sort of funny example to make the point that anthropology opens the door for us to measure, benchmark, and track maturity, which tells us about sizing, timing, and also gives us a framework for operationalization, something that we just have not had the tools to do in the past. It's a big deal because in the past, we've had to rely on industry data, and usually once you start seeing things in the industry, in sales numbers, it's already probably too late for innovation. So let's come back to our model. Really, the job of anthropology is to identify, imagine you're looking up at the night sky. The job of anthropology is to identify the natural constellations of meaning that exist within a culture. And that process of identifying these constellations of meanings allows us to decode belief systems. So each constellation is, in essence, a belief system. And usually what we find is in any culture, any topic, any issue that matters to your business, you will find a handful of belief systems, and they're not always mutually exclusive, and they all sort of compete with each other in order to define and shape the future of that space. And really our job as anthropologists is to help you understand exactly what those belief systems are, how big they are, how mature they are, how quickly they're growing and changing the landscape. Now let's apply this framework to a tangible example. And as I said before, I'm going to put this into the lens of food waste. And I'm just going to give you an illustration and apply this both into the context of a B2B company and a B2C company. And let's see how this might help you think through the timing, the sizing, and the operational framework for solving a problem as big as food waste. The reason why I use food waste is because anthropology has this unique ability in particular to solve problems that are more fuzzy. And a lot of us deal with, actually probably most of us, especially in innovation R&D, deal with the fuzzy front end a lot. And the fuzzy front end is probably the worst part of the process because it's fuzzy by definition. So what this food waste example will illustrate is step one is let's ask, what are the dominant belief systems? What are those constellations? When you look up at the night sky of food waste, what are those constellations naturally appearing that are shaping the human being's understanding of the topic? For illustration, I'm going to show you two. We actually uncover 6 belief systems here around food waste. If you're curious about this, feel free to reach out to me, and our contact information is later, and we'll share that with you. But I'm going to illustrate 2. The first constellation of meaning, the first belief system, is actually one that links food waste to budgeting and nutrition. So I'll explain that in a second. The second one is linking food waste to the supply chain. Now, these are examples of belief systems the human being, the consumer, holds in their minds with the concept of food waste. So this is in essence telling us how the human being is organizing information around food waste. How are they making sense of whatever it is we're throwing at them around food waste, whether it's new solutions, new campaigns, new programs, new business models. This is how they're making sense of it. And these are 2 of 6 dominant belief systems. The first one, applying this back to our iceberg model. And this is a real example. Client took food waste and took it to the consumer and said, hey, what do you think about when you think about food waste? Consumer says, oh, most common problem, especially when I think about saving money, is I always think I need to waste less food in my fridge. Very logical answer to the problem, but that's not actually what's driving the consumer. So when you look at the map of meaning, when you look at the map of language around the topic of food waste, what our anthropologists are able to do is decode that the underlying implicit belief system is actually one about saving money to buy more nutritionally dense food products. So actually the equation, the math equation in the consumer's mind is, if I reduce waste in the household, I'm going to be able to afford to buy more nutritionally dense products. Think about that for a second. That's a phenomenal insight because it applies not just to the problem of food waste, but it also starts to take us into the problem of access, into the problem of affordability of food, and so much else, all of which, by the way, we can also uncover by looking at adjacent spaces through anthropology. But that's for a subsequent webinar. And then, of course, we're then able to identify how those core beliefs link to manifestations. For example, here we see manifestations being, oh, if I'm wasting less food, I'm going to afford better quality snack bars, what I consider better quality, i.e. snack bars with organic fruits, for example, or organic ingredients. Or I might be able to afford organic fruits and vegetables from the fresh aisle, which I normally can't. Or I might be able to afford some key items from the ready-to-eat counters in the grocery store when I'm shopping, and so on and so forth. So this is the equation in the consumer's mind. Again, you cannot ask them this. You have to study the natural use and the structure of language, especially at the scale that we do, which is millions and millions of conversations that we're studying around food waste, to understand how is language naturally used and what is that teaching us about the constellations of meaning that are naturally emerging in clusters in consumers' mind. Let's take this to the next example around supply chain. So again, in the case of supply chain, the logical frame, you ask the consumer, the logical frame is, oh, the way I think about supply chain is maybe my grocery store should waste less unsold product. So that's the consumer's logical frame. But actually, again, when you distinguish it from the core belief system, when you look at the language map among millions of these interactions around food waste, you'll see that actually the conversations about minimizing the use of raw materials, maximizing the use of raw materials in the manufacturing and agricultural process. Now, again, the consumer does not technically know what maximizing the use of raw materials means. We have to solve that problem for them. But that's what they're thinking of. When they associate food waste with the supply chain, what they're thinking of is things that will maximize the use of raw materials. To them, that's a very logical way to think about minimizing waste. So let's apply that. Let's say you're a B2B company. Let's say you have a technology that will actually work in the supply chain to help maximize the use of raw materials. Maybe it minimizes waste. Maybe it minimizes skins of certain fruits and vegetables, or wastage of skin, or wastage of I don't know, shells of certain dried fruit, or whatever else the technology is. Suddenly you have a technology that is answering an underlying shift emerging in culture. Imagine putting that in the hands of your sales team. Imagine putting that in the hands of your R&D execs and your innovation execs, because now you're getting direction into what kinds of technologies you need to develop, so that you're not always just responding to the needs of your buyer, but rather leading the conversation, driving innovation and driving the discourse in terms of what your buyer will and should want, because the consumer is ultimately asking for it. So that's the B2B example. The B2C example in the same context could literally be a retailer acquiring a specific piece of technology and then marketing that to the consumer and finding a way to actually quantify that. Hey, turns out between 2021 and 2022, we have reduced X ton of wastage in the manufacturing process of, I don't know, our white labeled snack bars or what have you. So there's a lot of application, but the step one, the fuzzy front end, is the part that anthropology really helps us make tangible, which is help us get to the real core insight, the core belief, link the core belief to then the manifestations like avoiding certain raw materials. So for example, the consumer is now looking at ingredients on the back of the snack bar going, oh, does it have palm oil? I need to avoid that, as an example. So it will give you the specific manifestations, but it will allow you to distinguish the manifestations from the beliefs so that you don't fall for shiny object syndrome. You don't think the problem is about palm oil. You realize palm oil is an existing manifestation of a core belief that is about maximizing the use of raw materials. So this is really why I wanted to illustrate this example. Now, of course, in the interest of time, I'm not going to dive into deeper and deeper detail on this, but what I wanted to hopefully have you take away is that applying this iceberg model, this lens of decoding implicit meaning by looking at the map of language around a context, allows us to really start to see insight that we wouldn't otherwise get, allows us to then quantify that in terms of understanding where it sits in its maturity life cycle, understanding where it might potentially be headed in terms of its growth trajectory, and it allows us to build a natural cadence through the lens of the consumer. So for example, here we can see that if we have to build a strategy around food waste for whatever business we have to understand how the consumer is structuring and organizing that information, which means this will basically give us an operational plan to work backwards in order to understand what are the first challenges we should tackle. So the budget, nutritional density, first problem. Then we head to supply chain, then we head to something else and something else. In essence, this gives us a natural consumer-centric activation model. And I know I use the word consumer a lot, and I know if you're in the B2B industry, you're thinking, well, we don't use that word a lot, but I'm using it deliberately and very critically because we work with a lot of B2B businesses that are realizing that if they truly want to own the narrative, they have to have their finger on the pulse of how culture, consumer culture, is shifting the landscape of requirements for them. And this no longer just impacts somebody who's going direct to consumer. It impacts their suppliers. It impacts a farmer who's figuring out, what kind of dairy to produce. It applies all across the food chain, so to speak. But I think this is why the role of anthropology becomes such an opportunity here for us, because it allows us to A, look at the landscape differently from our competitors, but B, actually use a framework that is actionable, measurable, and that we can benchmark our own work against. And I think, isn't that what we all want ultimately, especially in the modern world? We want to be able to measure our own performance. We want to be able to tweak and optimize the operational execution of the work we do. And this is a critical way for us to start to do that. I'm going to end with the way I began, a reminder of the purpose of anthropology. As human beings, we all act toward things on the basis of the meaning we ascribe to those things. Ultimately, this is our job as anthropologists, and this is really the role of applying anthropology to innovation. Thanks for listening in today.
Great, thank you very much, Ujwal. It's a fascinating presentation. It's a really compelling tool. I'm excited about digging into how this applies to, and the ways that innovation teams can use it. We do have some questions coming in. Feel free to type other ones you have into the questions box, and if we don't get to it on the call here, somebody from Lux will be in touch afterwards. And maybe to start off with just kind of a basic methodology question, could you explain a little bit more about what the different zones on the maturity curve mean and how innovation teams use it? That zone of innovation is important, I'm guessing.
Exactly. This concept of maturity, is a fairly simple concept. You put let's say put a random sample of 100 people together in a room, and you ask them to define sustainability. What this maturity curve basically says is, if more than 33 out of these 100 people give you the same answer, this thing is mainstream. That's basically what the maturity curve says. And we arrived at this over many years of experimenting and benchmarking the work that our clients have put into market, but also benchmarking historical trends that have slowly evolved into mainstream relevancy. So what this allows us to now determine is there are different zones which teach us about the different types of activations we can do depending on where something sits. So for example, if something sits in new ideas, it's very, very nascent. Usually before it can make its way into mainstream, you're looking at least a 5-year window, if not more. And it can get disrupted pretty heavily because of stuff that happens in culture, an election, a pandemic, another pandemic, and so on. If something sits in early consensus, it means, okay, it's starting to stabilize. Our engine will actually do a prediction, so it can actually tell you, based on how the map of meaning is evolving, whether in fact people are building greater consensus in meaning. So it will tell you whether growth is coming and inching towards mainstream, but early consensus is usually where we want to see ideas sit, spaces sit, when we're looking at it for the purpose of R&D and innovation, because it gives you usually a 2 to 5 year window. And that's usually the typical life cycle, certainly we see with R&D and innovation. If your life cycle is shorter, kudos to you, amazing. And if that's the case, then you would look for things that are much closer to mainstream acceptance or in mainstream acceptance. And that kind of speaks for itself. It basically says there's enough consensus, this thing will naturally start to take shape. Once things cross 50% on the maturity curve, it basically means we have to pretty much follow the requirements laid out by the consumer. We can't reshape it. So the purpose of innovation becomes harder and harder as the topic becomes more and more mature. That's in essence what it's saying.
And another question that it goes to this methodology, are the conversations that you're analyzing here, is that global or is that limited to certain geographies, certain languages?
Yeah, great question. It is global, so we do work across 13 different countries. Obviously, North America, Latin America, Europe, Asia. We do a lot of work these days in Japan, in China, in India, obviously Western Europe, and so on. So yes, absolutely global. And of course, it is critical to say this out loud. As anthropologists, we do not have a single tool that is global. No such thing. Every culture has its unique nuances. We take a lot of pride and a lot of effort in looking at cultures through the natural language that exists within those cultures. So obviously in China, we're examining culture through the lens of the language of Mandarin dominantly. In India, we're looking at Hindi in particular, along obviously with English, and so on and so forth. And of course, the analysis is done understanding the cultural, country-specific nuances that help us interpret the use of language, because obviously the same word can mean something very different in one country versus another.
Yeah. And another question about kind of applying these tools in innovation processes. You've mentioned a few times the value and the great fit for anthropology and kind of analyzing new ideas at the fuzzy front end. But are there other kind of parts of the process, or portfolio management or refinement of later stage ideas that you see clients leveraging these tools in also?
Yeah, I would say among our R&D clients, about half of it is fuzzy front end and half of it is exactly as you described, sort of optimization work. Oftentimes people have ideas, they don't truly know how to prioritize them. Oftentimes people have ideas, they don't know if they're real enough or if they're all blowing smoke up, things like that we can help bring context into. So it definitely applies across the life cycle. Obviously, the purist in me will say the holy grail is when we can be involved throughout the life cycle with the fuzzy front end, driving the creation of concepting and the concepting process, and then bringing that back in to analyze, whether the concepts have veered too far off, the boundaries, and making sure that everything stays within sort of the consumer culture prescribed boundary, if you will. That's the holy grail, but of course, reality is we're a lot more practical than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, there's a lot to chew on, and I know some more questions that we'll have to follow up on. But I think that's about all the time that we have for the webinar here today. Thanks for joining us, and of course, thanks to Ujwal for the great presentation and responses. We will be sending around the slide presentation and the recording from the webinar to all the attendees on email later on today. When the session closes, you will be prompted to complete a survey. We really appreciate any feedback that you can give us. We really do look at that and use it to try to improve future webinars. And yeah, please take a look as well at some of the upcoming sessions and join us for those if you can as well. So thanks again, Ujwal. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.